When Dorian Kells fired me, he leaned back in his leather chair like he owned the world. His smirk stretched across his face as he slid the termination papers toward me. The mahogany desk between us felt like a canyon. "Your position has been eliminated," he said, not even trying to sound sorry. "Budget cuts, you understand. I am Edward Pierce, 42 years old, and the longest-serving senior legal counsel in a CAD industry's history. 15 years with this company. 15 years of staying late, fixing problems, writing contracts that kept us out of legal trouble. And this was my reward." "Any questions?" Dorian asked, still smirking. I looked up at him. His expensive suit, his perfectly styled hair, his arrogant eyes. I could have argued, could have begged, could have reminded him of all the times I saved his skin. Instead, I picked up the pen and signed my name. "No questions," I said quietly. His smirk grew wider. "Smart choice. Security will escort you out." I stood up, shook his hand like nothing happened, and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard him chuckling to himself. He had no idea what he just did. People thought I left that building broken. I saw it in their faces as security walked me past my old coworkers. Whispers followed me down the hallway. Poor guy? 15 years down the drain. But the truth was different. As I sat in my car in the parking garage, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Calm. Because while Dorian was busy congratulating himself, I remembered something he had forgotten. Something buried so deep in our company's legal history that even the lawyers probably forgot it existed. I started my car and drove home in silence. No angry phone calls to friends. No ranting about unfair treatment. Just quiet focus. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and opened my laptop. I knew exactly what I was looking for. My fingers moved across the keyboard, navigating through old folders I hadn't touched in years. Digital breadcrumbs from a different time, when the company was smaller and I was the one writing the rules. Finally, I found it. A folder labeled 2011 Compliance Archives. I clicked it open and smiled for the first time since morning. The hard drive hummed quietly as I connected it to my laptop. I hadn't touched this thing in years, but I knew it held exactly what I needed. File after file scrolled past on my screen. Old contracts, merger documents, compliance reports from when the company was just getting started. Back when Dorian actually listened to me. I found the folder I was looking for. Executive Compensation Framework, Final Draft. My heart beat a little faster as I opened it. There it was, buried on page 47 of a document most people never bothered to read. A clause I had written myself, back when I still believed in protecting everyone. Clause 11B. I read it 3 times to make sure I remembered it correctly. The language was clear, precise, and absolutely binding. I had crafted every word carefully, knowing that someday it might matter. And now, thanks to Dorian's arrogance, it was about to matter more than he could imagine. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The memory came flooding back. The day I begged him to let me update this language. His dismissive laugh. His exact words echoing in my mind. Nobody reads that fine print anyway. Clause 11B was simple but devastating. I read it again, savoring every word I had written 13 years ago. In the event of involuntary termination without cause of any executive signatory, all unvested compensation shall immediately accelerate and transfer to the terminated party upon completion of any major merger or acquisition exceeding $50 million in total value. The beauty was in the details. I had defined major merger broadly enough to catch almost anything. I had made the trigger automatic, requiring no approval from current management, and I had buried it so deep in legal language that nobody bothered to examine it. But the most beautiful part was the amount. Based on my original signing package and the company's current valuation, my unvested compensation would equal exactly $9.4 million. I remembered writing this clause during a late night in 2011. The company was growing fast, and I was worried about getting pushed out by new investors. So I built myself an insurance policy. Dorian had signed it without reading it. Just like he signed everything back then, too busy chasing his next big deal to sweat the details. I printed out the document and highlighted Clause 11B in bright yellow. Then I made 3 copies and locked them in my home safe. Now I just had to wait. I remembered that day in 2015 like it happened yesterday. I had gone to Dorian's office with a stack of legal updates, trying to modernize our old contracts. "We should clean up some of these legacy clauses," I had told him, pointing specifically to the compensation section. Some of this language is outdated. Dorian barely looked up from his phone. Why fix what isn't broken? Because these old contracts have some unusual provisions that might cause problems later. That's when he laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a full belly laugh that made his secretary look up from her desk. You worry too much, he said, waving me away. Nobody reads that fine print anyway. As long as it keeps the lawyers happy, leave it alone. I tried one more time. Dorian, I really think we should review the executive compensation framework. There are some clauses in there that... Drop it, he snapped. I don't have time for your paranoia. His arrogance became my insurance policy. Every time I suggested updates, he shut me down. Every time I tried to protect him from his own ignorance, he dismissed me. Now his arrogance was about to cost him everything. Over the next 3 days, I worked quietly and methodically. I gathered evidence like I was building a legal case, because in a way, I was. Screenshots of my original employment contract, digital signatures with timestamps, email chains showing my attempts to update the language. Every piece of documentation that proved Clause 11b was legitimate and binding. I created a secure folder on my laptop and organized everything chronologically. The original 2011 contract, my 2015 emails suggesting updates, Dorian's dismissive responses, my termination paperwork from this week. The timeline was perfect. A clear pattern of Dorian ignoring important legal details, culminating in the mistake that would destroy him. I also researched the company's current status. Stock prices, merger rumors, pending deals. What I found made my pulse quicken. 3 separate industry publications had mentioned merger talks. Nothing confirmed yet, but the pieces were falling into place. By Thursday evening, I closed my laptop and poured myself a glass of wine. The trap was set. All the documentation was ready. Now I just had to wait for Dorian to step into it. I raised my glass in a silent toast to the man who thought nobody read the fine print. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after my firing. I was drinking coffee and reading the news when my phone buzzed with a notification. Company newsletter. Exciting announcement. I opened it and couldn't help but smile. There was Dorian's face beaming from the screen, standing next to 3 executives I didn't recognize. The headline made my heart race. Landmark merger creates industry giant. $847 million deal reshapes market. I read every word twice. The company was merging with Morrison Industries, creating the largest firm in our sector. The deal was worth $847 million, far exceeding the $50 million trigger in Clause 11b. The newsletter quoted Dorian extensively. He called it the culmination of years of strategic planning. He bragged about his visionary leadership and attention to detail. Attention to detail. I almost choked on my coffee. The merger was scheduled to close in 30 days, pending regulatory approval and final documentation review. 30 days until Clause 11b would automatically execute. I forwarded the email to my personal account and saved it in my evidence folder. Then I poured myself another cup of coffee and started making phone calls. It was time to set the wheels in motion. Rowan Vale answered on the second ring. We had worked together for 8 years before he moved to the legal department. More importantly, he was one of the few people inside the company who actually read contracts carefully. I heard about your termination, he said quietly. I'm sorry. It was wrong. Thanks, Rowan. But I'm not calling about sympathy. I need to ask you something, and I need you to keep it between us. There was a pause. Okay, what's going on? Do you remember the old executive compensation framework from 2011? The one with all the legacy language that never got updated. Another pause, longer this time. Vaguely. What? I want you to look at Clause 11b. Really look at it. Then think about this merger they just announced. I could hear him typing on his keyboard. Then silence stretched for nearly a minute. Holy hell, he whispered finally. Are you serious? Dead serious. Every word of it. This clause, if it triggers during the merger, that's almost $10 million. $9.4 million, to be exact. The line went quiet again. I could practically hear his mind racing. Rowan? Are you still there? Yeah, I'm here. I'm just processing this. You wrote this clause. I did. And Dorian signed it. You're serious, aren't you? Completely. Rowan called me back the next morning. His voice was shaky with nervous excitement. I couldn't sleep last night, he said. I kept reading that clause over and over. It's airtight. I know. So what do you want me to do? Nothing dramatic. Just bring it up during the next merger review meeting. Casually mention that someone should double-check the old compensation agreements for any unusual provisions. They'll ask me why. Tell them you're being thorough, covering all the bases. You know how lawyers get nervous about legacy language. Rowan was quiet for a moment. This is going to cause chaos. That's the point. What if they try to challenge it? Let them try. I have documentation going back 13 years. Every signature, every email, every time I try to get Dorian to update these contracts. It's all legitimate. And you're sure about the trigger conditions? Positive. The merger announcement alone started the clock. Once it closes, the clause executes automatically. Automatically. No management approval required. No board vote. Just math. I heard him take a deep breath. Okay, I'll bring it up in tomorrow's meeting. Rowan. Yeah. Make sure Dorian is in the room when you mention it. The meeting happened exactly as I hoped. Rowan called me that evening, barely able to contain his excitement. You should have seen his face, he said. I mentioned Clause 11b, and everyone just stared at me blankly. So I read it out loud. How did Dorian react? He laughed, just like you said he would. I called it old code from a different era. Said nobody cares about legacy language that was never properly updated. Did he say that in front of the whole board? Every word. The meeting was recorded too. Standard procedure for merger discussions. I smiled. Dorian had just created evidence of his own negligence. On the record, in front of witnesses. What happened next? The lawyers got nervous. Started asking questions about other legacy provisions. But Dorian shut them down. Said they were wasting time on irrelevant details. Perfect. Then he said something that made my blood freeze. He looked right at me and said, if that clause was important, someone would have flagged it years ago. The fact that nobody noticed it proves it's meaningless. I laughed out loud. He just argued against himself. That's what I thought. But here's the best part. The head counsel asked if they should have legal review all the old compensation agreements, just to be safe. And Dorian said no. Called it a waste of billable hours. Rowan's mention of Clause 11b had planted the seed exactly as planned. Even though Dorian dismissed it, the lawyers couldn't ignore it completely. Legal departments hate surprises, especially during major mergers. They're doing a quiet review, Rowan told me during our next call. Nothing official, just due diligence. But they found the clause. And they're freaking out. Quietly. The language is crystal clear, and there's no way to challenge it without admitting gross negligence. What about Dorian? He still doesn't know? The lawyers are trying to figure out how to tell him without looking incompetent themselves. This was the delicate phase. I needed the lawyers to understand the clause was real and binding, but I didn't want them finding a way to neutralize it before the merger closed. Rowan, I need you to do something for me. What? If anyone asks where this clause came from, tell them the truth. I wrote it in 2011, Dorian signed it, and I tried multiple times to get it updated. You want them to know it was intentional? I want them to know it was professional, that I followed proper procedures and Dorian ignored them. It makes the clause harder to challenge. Smart. And Rowan? When they finally tell Dorian about this, make sure you're in the room. I want a witness to his reaction. The confrontation happened on a Friday afternoon. Rowan called me immediately afterward, his voice tight, with barely controlled laughter. The head counsel requested an emergency meeting with Dorian. Called it urgent legal matter requiring immediate attention. How many people were there? 5. Dorian, head counsel, 2 merger lawyers, and me taking notes. Perfect. Tell me everything. The counsel started by explaining they found some concerning language in the old executive compensation agreements. Dorian rolled his eyes and said to make it quick. Then what? She read Clause 11b word for word. Slowly. When she finished, the room was dead silent. I could picture Dorian's face as the implications sank in. How long before he exploded? About 10 seconds. He turned bright red and started yelling. Called it impossible, illegal, fraudulent. Demanded to know how something like this could exist. Did they tell him? The counsel pointed out that his signature was on the original document. That's when he really lost it. What did he say? He screamed that nobody told him about any clause. That it was buried in legal gibberish. That any reasonable person would have missed it. And the lawyers? They just stared at him. One of them finally asked if he read documents before signing them. I burst out laughing. What did he say to that? Nothing printable. What Dorian didn't know was that Clause 11B had already triggered. The moment the merger was announced publicly, an automatic escrow account was established based on the language I had written 13 years ago. I found this out through careful research and a phone call to the company's longtime banking partner. As someone with historic executive status, I still had access to certain financial information systems. The escrow account showed a balance of exactly $9.4 million, held pending completion of the merger. The system had calculated my compensation automatically, using current company valuations and the formula I had embedded in the original clause. Dorian could rant and threaten all he wanted, but the money was already set aside. The clause was executed exactly as I had designed it. I printed out the escrow confirmation and added it to my evidence file. Then I called my attorney to review everything one more time. "This is remarkable," she told me after reading through the documents. "The language is airtight. Even if they wanted to challenge it, they'd have to admit to signing contracts without reading them. And the trigger mechanism? Automatic and irreversible. Once the merger closes, the funds transfer immediately. How long do we have to wait?" Based on the timeline they announced, about 2 weeks. 2 weeks until Dorian learned the true cost of his arrogance. The call came on a Wednesday morning. Dorian's assistant, speaking in the carefully neutral tone of someone delivering bad news. "Mr. Kells would like to schedule a meeting with you to discuss some contractual clarifications." Clarifications? He'd prefer to explain in person. Would tomorrow afternoon work? I smiled. Dorian was finally ready to face the music. "Tomorrow at 3 works fine. Thank you." Conference room A on the executive floor. I hung up and immediately called Rowan. "They want to meet." "When?" "Tomorrow. I'm guessing they're going to try to negotiate." "What will you tell them?" "Nothing. There's nothing to negotiate. The clause is binding, and the merger is closing next week." Dorian's been in meetings with lawyers for 3 days straight. He's desperate. Good. Desperation makes people careless. "What if they offer you money to waive the clause?" I laughed. "They can't offer me enough money to waive a clause that's already worth $9.4 million. Fair point. Besides, this isn't about money anymore. This is about proving that details matter, that you can't just dismiss people who actually read the fine print. The next 24 hours crawled by. I reviewed my documents one final time and practiced staying calm. Tomorrow, I would walk back into that building as an equal, not a terminated employee. Walking into conference room, A felt like entering a courtroom. Dorian sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 lawyers I didn't recognize. His usual smirk was nowhere to be seen. "Thank you for coming," he said stiffly. I took the seat directly across from him and folded my hands on the table. "You wanted clarification about something." The head lawyer cleared her throat. "We've discovered some unusual language in your original compensation agreement. Specifically, Clause 11B. I'm familiar with it." "You wrote this clause?" "I did. Can you explain your intent?" I looked directly at Dorian. "My intent was to protect myself from arbitrary termination during major corporate changes, which, as it turns out, was remarkably prescient." Dorian's jaw tightened. "This clause is buried on page 47 of a 70-page document. No reasonable person would consider it prominent. I tried to discuss it with you multiple times over the years. You dismissed my concerns. I don't remember any such conversations." I opened my folder and slid a stack of printed emails across the table. "These might refresh your memory." The lawyers leaned forward to examine the documents. I watched their faces as they read through years of my attempts to update the compensation framework, each one rejected by Dorian. "These emails clearly show you tried to modernize the language," one lawyer said. "Multiple times," I confirmed. Dorian's composure finally cracked. He slammed his fist on the table, making everyone jump. "This is sabotage," he shouted. "You buried a poison pill in our contracts and waited for the perfect moment to detonate it." I remained perfectly calm. "I wrote a standard protection clause and tried repeatedly to discuss it with you. Your refusal to engage with the details is not my responsibility. You designed this to hurt the company. I designed this to protect myself. The fact that it hurts the company is a consequence of your negligence." The lawyers were no longer looking at me. Their eyes were fixed on Dorian, watching him spiral out of control in real time. "This will destroy the merger," he continued. $9.4 million could kill the entire deal. Then perhaps you should have read what you were signing. Nobody reads every clause in every contract. I do. That's why you hired me in the first place. One of the lawyers leaned forward. Mr. Kells, you should probably. Don't tell me what I should do. Dorian snapped. This is extortion. No, I said quietly. This is the natural consequence of signing documents without reading them. The room fell silent. Dorian stared at me with pure hatred, but for the first time since I'd known him, he had nothing to say. As we sat in that tense silence, something beautiful happened. The lawyer's phone buzzed with an alert. She glanced at it and went pale. Excuse me, she said, then stepped out of the room. She returned 2 minutes later with a strange expression on her face. The merger has just been finalized, she announced. All regulatory approvals came through this morning. The room went dead quiet. I felt a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. What does that mean? Dorian asked, though I could tell he already knew. It means Clause 11B has been triggered. The compensation transfer is now executing. Right there, in front of everyone, the lawyer's phone buzzed again. She looked at it and nodded slowly. The transfer has been completed. $9.4 million has been moved to the designated account. I watched Dorian's face as the reality hit him. His skin went gray. His hands started shaking. For the first time in 15 years, he looked genuinely afraid. How is that possible? He whispered. Automated systems, I explained calmly. When I wrote the clause, I built an automatic execution. No human approval required. One of the other lawyers was frantically typing on his laptop. The funds have cleared our main account. This is actually happening. I stood up slowly. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. For the first time in all the years I had known him, Dorian Kells looked completely broken. The arrogant smirk that had defined our relationship was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a man watching his world collapse. You've destroyed everything, he said quietly. I've collected what was legally owed to me under a contract you signed. The board will never forgive this. The investors will pull out. You've killed the company. I paused at the door. I didn't kill anything, Dorian. I just read the fine print. As I walked down the hallway, I could hear raised voices behind me. The lawyers were already trying to manage the crisis, but there was nothing to manage. The clause was executed, the money was transferred, and the damage was done. I took the elevator down to the lobby and walked outside into the afternoon sunlight. My phone was already buzzing with notifications, but I ignored them. Instead, I got in my car and drove to a small cafe downtown. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching normal people go about their normal lives. In a few hours, the business world would explode with news about the failed merger and the CEO who lost $9 million to a clause he never bothered to read. But right now, I was just a man enjoying his coffee in peace. The story broke faster than I expected. By 6 p.m., the business networks were running headlines about the catastrophic oversight that had derailed one of the year's biggest mergers. CEO ignored fine print, lost $9.4 million, scrolled across every financial news ticker in the country. The details were brutal. Unnamed sources within the company described Dorian as recklessly inattentive to contractual details and dismissive of legal counsel. Someone had leaked the email chains showing my repeated attempts to update the compensation framework. By morning, the damage was irreversible. 3 major investors had announced they were pulling out of the merger. Stock prices plummeted 23% before trading was halted. The board called an emergency meeting for Friday morning. Industry analysts were already predicting Dorian's resignation. My phone rang constantly, reporters, old colleagues, headhunters who suddenly thought I was a genius. I ignored them all. Instead, I sat in my kitchen reading the news coverage and marveling at how quickly 15 years of Dorian's reputation had evaporated. One article quoted an anonymous board member. How do you trust a CEO who signs $9 million liabilities without reading them? Another featured commentary from a corporate governance expert. This represents a fundamental failure of executive oversight. The fine print had finally gotten the attention it deserved. The merger collapsed completely by Monday morning. Morrison Industries released a terse statement citing unforeseen legal complications and concerns about due diligence procedures. The stock price went into free fall. By noon, the company had lost over 40% of its market value. Trading was suspended twice as panic selling overwhelmed the exchanges. I watched it all from my living room, feeling strangely detached from the chaos. This wasn't personal revenge anymore. It was just math playing out according to rules that had been written 13 years ago. Rowan called me around lunchtime. "The office is in complete meltdown," he said. "Half the executives are in closed-door meetings with lawyers. The other half are updating their resumes. What about Dorian? He hasn't left his office in 2 days. Word is the board has given him until Friday to submit his resignation. And if he doesn't, they'll vote him out anyway. This is the biggest corporate disaster in company history. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine. Actually, I'm sort of proud to have been part of this. You taught everyone an important lesson about reading contracts." After we hung up, I opened my laptop and transferred $2.1 million to a scholarship fund for compliance students. It felt like the right thing to do with money earned from other people's negligence. The call came at 11 p.m. on Thursday night. I was already in bed when my phone rang with a number I recognized but hadn't seen in weeks. Dorian's voice was barely recognizable. Shaky, hollow, defeated. "You win," he said without preamble. "What do you want?" "I don't want anything, Dorian. I already have what was owed to me. Don't play games. You orchestrated this whole thing. What will it take to make this go away?" "Nothing can make this go away. The money is transferred, the merger is dead, and your reputation is destroyed. Those are just facts now. I'll resign tomorrow. Publicly apologize. Take full responsibility. Just help me salvage something from this." I was quiet for a long moment, listening to his ragged breathing. "Dorian, do you remember what you said when you fired me?" What? You said budget cuts. You said my position was eliminated. But we both know that wasn't true." Silence. "You fired me because you could. Because you thought I was irrelevant. Because you never bothered to understand what I actually did for this company." "I'm sorry." "No, you're not sorry. You're scared. There's a difference." I hung up and turned off my phone. The board meeting happened at 9 a.m. sharp on Friday morning. I wasn't there, but the results were public within minutes. Dorian Kells had been forced to resign as CEO, effective immediately. The press release cited fundamental disagreements about corporate governance and risk management. The local news stations covered his walk of shame as he left the building for the last time. Cameras captured him hurrying through the lobby with his head down, carrying a single cardboard box. No smirk this time. No arrogant swagger. Just a broken man who had finally learned that details matter. The interim CEO held a press conference that afternoon, promising comprehensive reviews of all legacy contractual obligations and renewed commitment to executive oversight. When reporters asked about Clause 11B specifically, she said, "This situation illustrates why we must read and understand every document we sign. There are no small details in corporate governance." I watched the coverage from my kitchen table, eating a sandwich and checking my bank account. $9.4 million, sitting there like proof that sometimes the little guy actually wins. The money was nice, but the vindication was better. With the immediate chaos settled, I had time to think about what came next. $9.4 million was enough to change my life completely, but it also came with responsibility. I called my financial advisor and set up the scholarship fund I had been planning. $2.1 million would fund compliance education for students who might otherwise never afford it. "I want to support people who actually read the fine print," I told her. The rest of the money went into conservative investments. I wasn't interested in flashy purchases or revenge spending. This was about security and independence, not showing off. I also decided to write a detailed account of everything that had happened, not for publication, but for my own records. Future generations of executives needed to understand what happens when you dismiss the people who actually know how things work. The account ran 57 pages when I finished it. Every email, every conversation, every moment of Dorian's arrogance carefully documented. I printed it out, bound it in a leather folder, and locked it in my safe next to the original Clause 11B documents. Someday, someone might need to understand exactly how precision triumphed over arrogance. That evening, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a glass of good whiskey, the kind I couldn't afford back when I was working for Dorian. I thought about the day he fired me, the smirk on his face as he dismissed 15 years of loyalty. The way he chuckled to himself as I walked out of his office. That laugh had haunted me for weeks. Not because it hurt, but because it revealed everything about who he really was. A man so arrogant that he found genuine pleasure in other people's misfortune. Now the laugh seemed different. Smaller. Pathetic, even. I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires emotional investment, and Dorian no longer deserved that much of my attention. He was just a cautionary tale now, a man who confused authority with intelligence. I raised my glass in a silent toast to everyone who had ever been dismissed by someone who should have known better. Then I drank my whiskey and went to bed. For the first time in months, I slept soundly. A week later, I was walking through downtown when I saw him. The new CEO, the one who had replaced Dorian. She was coming out of the coffee shop I had started frequenting. Our eyes met across the sidewalk. She recognized me immediately and walked over. "You're the Clause 11B guy," she said with a slight smile. "I prefer to think of myself as the fine print guy." She laughed. "I wanted to thank you, actually. Your situation forced us to audit all our legacy contracts. We found 17 other problematic clauses that could have caused trouble later. Just doing my civic duty. The board has implemented new policies requiring legal review of all executive decisions. No more signing documents without reading them. Sounds reasonable." She extended her hand. "I know this situation was painful, but you've made us a better company." I shook her hand and nodded respectfully. Then I continued walking down the street. For the first time since Dorian fired me, I allowed myself a small smile. Not the cruel smirk he used to wear, but something quieter, something earned. I had proven that precision matters, that details have consequences, that sometimes the person everyone ignores is the one paying attention. Behind me, the city continued its busy hum, but I walked through it calmly, knowing that somewhere in a corporate boardroom, executives were actually reading their contracts. The fine print had finally gotten the respect it deserved.